If you have the deep determination to succeed, you will not fail. Continue to dare to dream with me on this real estate community show. I'm talking about real estate today. I'm your host, Denise Smith. We're talking about part 2 in the series of real estate stories. I hope you enjoy my stories today because you might see yourself in some of these situations. I'm talking about real buyers buying real estate and real sellers purchasing and selling real estate. Today, I want to talk about first just the beginning, just to let you know, if you desire to purchase real estate, what you need to do is work with a real estate broker that you trust. Number one, find out the credentials of the real estate agent or real estate broker and find out references from people so that you can feel comfortable with that individual. The next thing you need to do is get pre-qualified. You always have to get pre-qualified, and you need to put together some items. First, you put together your bank statements for 3 months, your W-2s or tax returns for 2 years, and your paycheck stubs if you're salaried for 1 month. Put those items together, and you then take those items to the bank and get pre-qualified. I need to tell you that in the beginning because if you want to purchase real estate, that is what you need to do. Now, we're going to talk about real estate stories. The first story that I would like to talk about is that I represented a buyer, and the buyer was purchasing real estate, and when they were buying the real estate, they called themselves investors. They wanted to be an investor. What does an investor mean? An investor means where, for me, at one time, I had acquired 120 units. I was really a true investor. I loved real estate, but it was a little bit real estate addiction a little bit. I think that I got a little too gung-ho on this real estate. But I believe that if I can do it, you can do it too. So this investor called himself an investor. So I asked him how many properties had he purchased. He said, I purchased a couple of properties. So I teased him and said, oh, you dibble and dabble in real estate? Oh, he got insulted with me because he was like, I'm an investor. Okay, so from there on that point on, I called him an investor. That investor started to do things that I didn't feel comfortable with. That investor started purchasing real estate, but when he was I was happy about him purchasing real estate, but what he was doing is he was purchasing 3 properties at the same time. But the thing he was doing, which I realized afterwards, is that he decided he wanted to buy 3 properties, but he didn't want to tell the bank that he was purchasing these 3 properties at the same time. So what he would do is he would use me, one real estate agent, for the 1 property. You see, because being a licensed real estate broker, you're licensed by the state of California. So you have to make sure that you do things according to the rules and the codes, because if you don't, you'll lose your license. I've never had a lawsuit. I've never had a dispute. I'm so thankful for that. But the thing is that I never knew what he was doing. But he kept saying, I'm an investor. Okay. So what he did is that he purchased 1 property with me, and I represented him as the agent. Then he went around and he worked with other real estate agents at the same time. So then he would go and he'd buy another property, and then he'd buy another property. So what he would do is he'd buy 3 different properties with 3 different agents. That's considered fraud. When I found out about it, I told him that that was fraudulent and that he couldn't do that because he was not disclosing to the banks. He could not disclose to the banks that he was doing that, because if he disclosed to the bank may not qualify him for 3 houses. So what he would do is he would purchase the houses at the same time and close them all on the same day. That was fraud. So I told him I couldn't work with him anymore. He then got a little upset with me and told me that he would go and work with other agents, that there were other agents that would love to work with him. I told him I don't think he should do that because that's considered to be fraudulent, and being fraudulent is against the law. So he fired me as a real estate agent and went on and did his thing. 10 years later, I was reading about him in the newspaper that he was having to do all kinds of time in jail because he went on to do other things that wasn't right. The point I want to make to you is that when you buy property, you want to work with someone that has morals and principles and ethics. You see, a licensed real estate broker has ethics that they have to follow. And if they do not follow the ethics, they could lose their license. That was a situation that I really, really hated to do because I really wanted to work with him as an agent. As I was an agent, I was new, and I wanted to work with him. But I had principles, and I had ethics, and I had morals. And I couldn't do anything that was illegal. And I'm thankful that I didn't. So as an investor, be careful. Be careful. If you want to become a buyer and you want to invest in real estate, you want to work with people that really know the laws. I have another story. This will be story number 4. And story number 4 is a seller that wanted to sell their property, but they didn't want to tell the buyer what's wrong with the property. They kept saying to me, if I tell the buyer what's wrong with the property, they won't buy it. They don't want to buy it. And I would say to them, you have to, because the law is real clear that if you don't tell the buyer what's wrong with that property, that they could sue you later on that you didn't disclose it. Real estate right now is disclosure, disclosure, disclosure. Most people say it's location, location, location. And I'm going to talk about location in a little bit later. But disclosure, disclosure, disclosure. I'll go back to the seller. The seller did not want to disclose things. So once they found out that I was going to have to disclose everything that I'm aware of, because I'm licensed by the state of California, and I have to do the right thing for the potential buyer that's purchasing that property. So everything I knew about the property, I told them. The seller held back on some things. They closed the transaction. They found out the next door, because you see, neighbors will always tell you everything what's going on with property. So you don't want to fib to the potential buyer because they're going to find out. And actually, when they live in the property, they will find out if you know, even in inspections, sometimes you don't everything is not clear. So sometimes you may not see everything at one time. So this seller chose not to disclose to this buyer about a serious issue that took place on this property. Okay. Now, fast forward, the seller sells the property, the buyer buys the property, and then a neighbor comes over with cookies and cakes and says, "You're our new neighbor. Did you know that somebody was killed in this property? That there was a serious homicide that took place in this property? That they were stabbed 20 times? Did they tell you about that?" And they said they were very discouraged and very upset because they were very concerned that why didn't that seller tell them that? This is a real true story. So they called me up and they said, "We're going to sue you because you didn't tell me that there was a serious homicide that took place in this property." And I said to them, I didn't know. Had I known, I would have told you. They sued the seller, and they got part of that money back on that property because they should have told them that an incident like that took place on the property. That's story number 4. Now, we're going to talk about story number 5. You see, location, location, location is everything. And when you buy property, location is important. You want to look around for the schools. You want to look around for fire hydrants. You want firehouses. You want to look around to see everything that's close in proximity to that property. In the event that there's a fire in the property, you want to know how close it's going to take for the firehouse to for the firemen to get there. And you want to also know about the schools, the school's ratings. You want to know about that. You want to know about the things that are in parks. You want to know how close the parks are to that home. All of that. I have a story for you. There was a house that a person purchased. And after they purchased this house, it was a beautiful house. And after they purchased it, they found out that the whole top floor had been flooded. The seller never once said at one time the whole top floor had been flooded. They had had inspections. They did all the inspections and everything. They find out later, years later, there's mildew under the deck, under the hardwood floors. It was a lot of money that had to be paid for this. The seller asked me, did I know about the flooding? No, the buyer, excuse me, after he bought it, asked me, did I know about the flooding? The seller never once disclosed that there was a major flood that took place in that property. Never disclosed it. And what happened? They were sued. And as a good real estate agent, you don't want things like that to take place. So I will over-disclose just to make sure that my buyer knows everything that's wrong with that property. And if they decide that they don't want to buy the property, great. Move on to the next property. Because you see, you got to know what's wrong with the property before you buy it. You don't want to find out afterwards about these things. I was very disappointed because I lost a very good client. A very good client. Had I known about that, I would have told them. I would have told them. I didn't know. Now, I'm going to tell you of another disclosure item that took place. I think a lot of people had remembered about the big fire that took place in the Oakland Hills. Well, what a lot of people don't know is that that fire, a major fire in the Oakland Hills, happened twice in a 12-year period. I didn't know. Now, the buyer purchases the property, and after the very first 12 years hit, a huge fire in Oakland Hills. And I'm sure you read about it. I'm sure you saw it on the news. Or maybe you just moved here from out of state and you know nothing about it. Well, I'm from San Francisco, and I crossed the bridge. My grandma said that bad people lived in Oakland, but I learned different. There's wonderful people in Oakland and wonderful people in Berkeley and wonderful people all over. Bad people live everywhere. And to think, I'm from Hunters Point, Bayview. Hunters Point, Bayview, if anybody knows that area, is a different kind of area, a wonderful place to purchase, but there's a lot that has taken places in those areas. So I'm going to go back to my story. So the seller sells the property. I'm so gung-ho, so excited to sell it to them. 12 years later, they own this property. This fire number 2 breaks out. The gentleman that I sold to was an attorney. I never once knew, because I wasn't from Oakland, that there was a major fire 12 years prior. I never knew that because I wasn't in the area. I lived in San Francisco when all this took place. Okay? So now, 12 years later, big fire breaks out again, and they lose everything. House burns down to the ground. The client of mine that was an attorney comes to me and says, "Why didn't you tell me that there was a fire 12 years ago?" I told him I didn't know. I did not know that there was a fire 12 years ago. He didn't sue, and I was very thankful. But it's really important that you know the location that you're buying in. Now, if you're on an area where there's really thin streets, and you need to look to see if a fire engine can come get on those little narrow streets. If a fire engine cannot get in on those narrow streets, you might want to think twice. Those are the things you want to look at. You want to look at the neighborhood, and you want to go there at all hours of the day. You want to go in the morning, You want to go at noon? You want to go at night, at midnight? You want to do a drive-by? You want to go at all different times, because once you go all the different times, you'll get a really good idea how the sun sets, if it's cloudy all day, or if the sun is bright all day. You know, you could drive in different locations and go from one city to the next city and be beautiful on one block and cold and foggy 3 blocks away. So you want to make sure of where you're buying. Very important. You know, there's some cultures that will not buy houses that are certain numbers. There's certain cultures that will not buy properties if the sun sets on a certain side. And there's certain cultures if the numbers aren't right, or even the street isn't right. If the street drives to a house and you'll run right into the house, some cultures don't believe in that. Also, if somebody passed away in the house, that must be disclosed to you. For the last 3 years, if somebody passed away in that home in the last 3 years, you got to disclose it. It's very important that you disclose it. You see, if you do not disclose it, what could happen is you can get sued. And you want to work with a really good real estate agent or broker that really takes good care of you and really knows the area and been selling in the area a long time. I'm very thankful now, because the area that I sell in the Bay Area, I've been selling since 1990. So I'm very comfortable now with knowing different things that are taking place in different cities. And I sell in the whole Bay Area because that's where I'm from. I'm from San Francisco, but I've been in Oakland. So I sell all over. I sell in the Bay Area. If I have a client, and they're a good client that I've sold houses to before, if they want to buy outside of the city, I'll go with them. And I'll help them. And I will research that area through the chamber of, whatever chamber is in that area, or with the different city council. I work with the city councils. I really investigate what you're buying. You see, because if you don't work in that area every day, it's always good that you work with someone that works in that area every day, because that way you can help people to purchase property, and so they can feel comfortable with purchasing property and really feel comfortable in knowing that they received a good investment on the right side of the street, and not have that much work to do, and just be real clear on what you're purchasing. Buyer beware. Buyer beware. Sellers. All sellers have to disclose everything that they're aware of that's wrong with that property. And I say to you, do it. Do it. Don't be afraid that the person's not going to buy the property because you didn't disclose it. Be real careful. You see, because if you don't disclose it, there's a possibility you can get sued. So you don't want to put yourself in that kind of predicament. Just disclose it. If the house isn't for them, there'll be another buyer that it will be for them. So be real comfortable with disclosing everything that you're aware of that's wrong with that property, because the real estate agent has to do it as well. So understand and feel comfortable that your imperfections are just imperfections, but it's okay. You price it right. You look at the comparables in the area. You make sure that you are working with a reputable real estate agent or real estate broker, and you'll be able to be okay. That's exciting when you can find, I get excited when I could find a buyer and a seller, a buyer that loves the property and the seller just wants to sell the property. The meetings of the minds where it's the buyer pays what the seller wants, the seller is agreeing to it. A good transaction is the meeting of the minds means when the buyer agrees to the agreement and the seller agrees to the agreement. That's a ratified contract. That is what we call a ratified contract. And it's such a blessing when the buyer and the seller can come to the meeting of the minds, that, you know, that they can negotiate and still purchase the property. That's a blessing. That is a true blessing when that happens. You know, I have so many stories that I would love to share with you, and I really believe that these stories will help either a buyer or a seller. And I really believe that the stories that took place, they're real stories. I don't say any names because I can get in trouble. All my stories are confidential. You see, as a licensed real estate broker, you cannot disclose confidential information regarding the property. You can't disclose anything that I can't give tax advice, nor can I give legal advice. So all the stories that I tell, because I've sold hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of houses, nobody will ever know which story for which person this is. They're all true stories. I had one other story. You know, if there's a sex offender in your neighborhood and you know it, do you know you have to disclose it? If you don't disclose it, then you give a site that says you could look it up on your own and see. I had a seller one time tell me I asked were there any sex offenders in the neighborhood, and the wife said yes. And she said, my husband. I thought she was kidding, but she was not. So we had to disclose that. We had to disclose that on the disclosure statement. You see, that's part of a real estate transaction, that you have to disclose those kind of things. It's very important. Anything that you know that took place in your neighborhood, that you have to disclose it. It's not going to kill your deal. Don't be concerned about that, because there's always one buyer for the house, one buyer for that house, so you never have to worry. One buyer. And if this one buyer goes away, you'll find another buyer. Be careful in pricing your home so that you can make sure and sell it at a good price. Now, I have another story. This story has to do with generational wealth. Generational wealth. This is really where my heart is right now. Generational wealth means that you own the property for years and years and years. It goes from your grandfather and grandmother to their children, to their children, to their children, to their children. You see, for a while, minorities weren't able to purchase in certain locations. And therefore, ultimately, they end up having to buy, like I'll give you an example. In the certain hills and certain predominant areas, the African Americans could not, or minorities could not purchase in those areas. So what happened is those areas that they could not purchase in went up, and the areas that they were able to purchase in kind of stayed a little low. So what happens is that when you're purchasing real estate, the only reason why I believe that's really important for this today is because generational wealth is important. When you're low income, you may never have another opportunity to own again. So prepare yourself for if you own property so that it could go for generations and generations and generations. Look into getting a trust in that property so that when you fill out a trust, that property can stay in the family. You see, if you do not fill out a trust, it can go to probate. And I have a story, another story for you. The story sits in this scenario: generational wealth. The granddaughter wanted to buy the grandmother's property. She cried and cried and cried. She wasn't able to. You know why? The grandmother did not put it in trust. You know what else happened? She didn't have a will either. But even if you have a will, it'll go to probate. So you want to be real careful. If you own real estate right now, look at putting your stuff in a trust so you can create your legacy of generational wealth. This is very important. You see, what happened to this young lady, the investors came in and they priced the home up so high that when it went to probate in court, she wanted to buy the property. But because she was low income, she wasn't able to. So the investors priced that house so high that she couldn't afford it. So they bought the property out of court. She cried, she cried, she cried. She came to me and she said, "Help me, Denise, please help me. I want to buy my grandmother's house." So I went to the investor and I spoke to the investor and I said, "Can you please help this young lady to purchase real estate?" And she said, "Okay." They said, "No, she can't afford it." I said, "If I could show you that she can afford it, will you help her buy her grandmother's house?" They said, "No, no." What happened? He then sells it to somebody. That person falls through. Couldn't qualify, it didn't work. So then I still kept calling him on the phone saying, please help this young lady. All she wants to do is buy her grandmother's house. And you see, I was raised by my grandmother. So I know what that means to have something from your grandmother. Generational wealth is important. So I cried with her. So the investor called me up and he said, the deal fell through. And I said, I'm telling you, she can qualify for this house. I will help her. He said, if you can get her to buy this house and you can qualify her, then I'll sell it to her. I said, it's on. Dare to dream. We believe if you could dream it, you could have it. We started getting to work. I said, let's do this. I got her qualified. The bank approved her. She bought that house. Yes, she did. And that was a dream house for her. But guess what happened? It wasn't a bad story for her. You see, because that investor, that grandmother never maintained that house. That house was falling down in every area. She never maintained that house in the 60 years she owned it. 60 years. Never maintained it. The house was ready to collapse. But what happened is that investor fixed up that whole house for that young lady, and she bought it, she qualified, and if I'm not mistaken, I haven't talked to her. I'm going to have to call her and see if she's still in that house, because I believe she's still in that house to this day. I really do believe it. I'll never forget her. I'll never forget her, because when she purchased that house, she hugged me, she told me how much she appreciated me, and I knew that was a blessing that she was able to buy her grandmother's house, and it was all fixed up. And that was a very good, happy ending for her. I have so many stories because I've sold hundreds and hundreds of houses. So I have so many stories. I hope you continue to watch and continue to pick up on the stories, because if you're a buyer or a seller or somebody that even is just curious about real estate, you may enjoy these stories, because you know what? Everybody has an opportunity to purchase real estate. Everybody does. Whether you're a buyer, whether you're a seller, whether you are a person that's just interested in real estate, you might enjoy some of these stories. I've enjoyed you today, and I hope that you've enjoyed all the stories, because there's many more stories to come. And they have good endings. Some of them have not so good endings. But I want your real estate stories to be a good ending. So I want you to continue to look at real estate, continue to be excited about real estate, and find yourself a good real estate agent if you're interested in purchasing real estate. If you have the deep determination to succeed, you will not fail. Continue to dare to dream with me in real estate, and I tell you what, all your dreams will come true. Because if you plan properly, the plan will come out to your favor. Invest in real estate. It's the best thing that will secure your financial futures. If you continue to dare to dream with me, you will own real estate one day. Continue to dare to dream. God bless you.